podcast you're about to listen to is from a book series on postqualitative, new materialist and critical posthumanist research. You can find it on the following website, www.postqualitativeresearch.com. I'm Karin Murris and wrote the introduction to this first book in this series called Navigating the Postqualitative, New Materialist and Critical Posthumanist Terrain Across Disciplines, an introductory guide. We thought it would be helpful to have podcasts by the authors of each chapter, and the aim of the podcast is to share some ideas and to give you a brief flavour of each chapter and how these worked in the author's own contexts. In my introductory chapter called Making Kin, I've diffracted through some ideas and citation that struck me as I was reading through the draft chapters. They're not neatly in a list at the end of this introductory chapter, but I've sprinkled them throughout, a bit like an exotic spice or herb added to a meal. And they hopefully invite you to read more of the book, assuming you read it linearly, of course, which I don't think many people do, to be honest. But anyway, I hope they excite and inspire you to play, as Karin Murris puts it, with the rich and penetrating aromas of scientific practice on your tongue and let it pervade your cells. In their own different ways, each chapter in this book invites readers to do just that. The authors embrace the complexity involved in the ontological shift from qualitative to post-qualitative research, while avoiding the risk of getting lost in dense abstractions, and they engage with some of the complexities and profound tensions in the field without necessarily attempting to resolve these. Instead, they regard them as productive forces to co-produce new research practices. In the introduction, I describe how this book functions as an accessible introductory guide to support novices as well as experienced researchers. It's written for all those working in disciplines, but also for those who work transdisciplinary and in that way maybe even undiscipline the disciplines. The specific focus of this book, as well as this series as a whole, is on how to teach and how to supervise students whose research is inspired by posthumanism, new materialism, new empiricisms, feminist materialism, etc., etc. Post-qualitative research or inquiry in the American literature involves much unlearning because it shifts the relationality between ontology and epistemology and ethics, and thereby profoundly unsettling how to do research. And how it does this has been looked at from different angles. Now, the idea is that readers find their own way within these rich offerings on the edge of theory, practice, and continue to struggle with the inherent contradictions of post-qualitative new materialist and critical posthumanist research. At least the following 4 questions that are looked at from different perspectives. Firstly, what is post-qualitative research and who or what is included in research inspired by critical posthumanism and new materialism? Secondly, what questions does post-qualitative research raise about subjectivity, data, agency, experience, causality, and so forth that makes us think and value research differently? Thirdly, what is the point in doing research if the familiar claims about objectivity, mapping fields of inquiry through literature reviews, reflexivity, and filling gaps are to be abandoned? Lastly, if post-qualitative research resists claims about progress, telos, or purpose in research, why even bother engaging with it? Isn't it a contradiction in terms to do post-qualitative research? What is the point even in reading this book? This first book in the series includes visual images, links to other websites, and references to secondary sources that are particularly helpful, and not just as footnotes. Its primary use is as a resource alongside or in companion with the primary texts and original sources written by key philosophers and theorists. Because the primary texts are philosophically complex, it's a good idea to create special reading groups for this purpose. Now, a second use of this book is as a standalone guide for teachers or students wanting a clear and concise introduction to the post-qualitative, new materialist and critical posthumanist research field. But whether it's used alongside primary text or on its own, this book cannot replace deep reading. Nor is it a how-to recipe for doing research. But reading it should help in reimagining possibilities for research projects and being inspired to take the plunge. So why is the chapter called Making Kin? In this chapter, I share some of my experience of working with students and how I've introduced them to critical posthumanism. By asking them to draw their family tree, we provoke each other in thinking with the concept family. The challenge in post-qualitative research is to work creatively and philosophically with existing concepts such as I, we, family, community, friendship, intelligence, intention, etc., and to reconfigure these in ways that include the more than human. Sometimes this is done by creating new words, so-called neologisms, and at other times by redefining or reconfiguring very familiar concepts. Working slowly from the familiar to the much less familiar idea of the post-human family has proved to be very fruitful. How does the concept family actually work to include and exclude? Now, I linked this radical work with the coronavirus pandemic in this introductory chapter. The virus can be looked as an open invitation to reconfigure our relationships with the other than human and to do some composting, as Donna Haraway would say, letting the air in. The pandemic is a useful reminder that the world is indeterminate and that SARS-CoV-2 is as much a part of that world as we humans are. It's all a matter of scale. Post-qualitative research asks critical questions about who and what counts in research, and matters of scale also count. Images of SARS-CoV-2 have been taken up in the introduction, and the color can be found on this website. In the chapter, I ask, how can something so tiny and beautiful cause so much human suffering, pain, and violence? Drawn by South African editorial cartoonist Brendan Reynolds, the virus floats in space-time as big as a planet. Ironically, the current grand narrative conflates the virus SARS-CoV-2 with the disease COVID-19. It frames the virus as extraordinary, a stranger danger outside us humans that we need to defend ourselves against. But the virus can also be seen as an open invitation to reconfigure matters of scale and put into question the micro-macro binary of a world that is not only uncertain, but indeterminate. The art gets inside our skin and reworks ontologically who we are. But this book was not only written during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was also written during the re-emergence of Black Lives Matter, expressed by another one of Brendan Reynolds' profound cartoons called George Floyd, The Dark Side of the World, a poignant reference to the rock group Pink Floyd. Given the context in which the authors of this book had to do their writing, it's remarkable we ever managed to finish. And in many different ways, our writing continues and never will finish. It's only the beginning of many possible futures that can't be predicted. Because as you hold and read this book, as you take some of its ideas in your own doings, you become with it and make it into something different. Having said that, we, the chapter authors, and I, as author of this introduction, are responsible to you, our readers, to our non-human earthly others, and to those who we become kin with in our ongoing becomings. Together, we are working through how to reconfigure knowledge, research, and pedagogy as we navigate the post-qualitative new materialist and critical post-humanist terrain across disciplines together. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to know more about this chapter, please visit the website www.postqualitativeresearch.com, and please stay tuned for future podcasts.